destroyed the body. Very few people can use drugs for that long without being completely, their total physical health wiped out after a while. And what we're looking at with the AIDS epidemic, and this was the very first suspicion that crossed the mind of the first scientists who looked at these AIDS cases, was that this was a product of the severe drug use going on in the male homosexual community that is not seen nearly as much anywhere else in the population. Even with the widespread drug abuse today, none of it is as severe as among male homosexuals in particular, more than even female homosexuals because of the promiscuity and so forth. And that was, in fact, the very first thing that was suspected as the cause of AIDS before a political decision was made that this epidemic should be blamed on a virus and should believed to be infectious, that we can all catch it. That's the propaganda from the federal government and from the gay rights lobby, is that AIDS is a disease that anybody can catch. You could be middle class, heterosexual, with a family in the suburbs, going about your business in a normal way. You can be a Bible-believing person going to church. You too can get AIDS. That has been the propaganda now for 10 years because they want to believe it's a virus. And when we talk, one of the sources of opposition we get as scientists trying to point out what we believe to be the cause of AIDS here, based on some very powerful evidence that has been uncovered in the last several years, and which we summarize in our book, that every time we talk about it, one of the leading sources of opposition, other than the federal AIDS establishment, is the gay rights lobby, which receives, as I said, a lot of money from the pharmaceutical industry now with regard to AIDS, and a lot of money from the Centers for Disease Control and from the federal government, and who get very angry at us. And this really surprised us at first until we thought about it, who get very angry with us for blaming the victim and for letting heterosexual people, ordinary middle-class folk, off the hook to where they don't feel, where we're, in effect, we're letting people know they don't catch AIDS unless they're doing long-term heavy drug use.
That last statement that you made, how do people get AIDS? Are there 2 or 3 ways that a person can develop full-grown AIDS? And the follow-up question, can a person who has developed AIDS be healed?
Well, okay, both are excellent questions. So we don't believe you can catch AIDS. It's not caused by any virus at all. That, in other words, the virus is the HIV is the 4th virus blamed for AIDS. In fact, before then, the virus hunters, who are the most powerful men in the biomedical research establishment, were trying to blame other viruses for AIDS. First, they chose cytomegalovirus, which causes a disease that's not unlike mononucleosis, but they also wanted this virus to cause AIDS. Then they switched to Epstein-Barr virus, which does cause the classical mononucleosis that we know about, and that one also they wanted to blame for AIDS. Then they went to HTLV1, which was a retrovirus and also harmless, but they wanted to blame it for leukemia and then also for AIDS. And finally, they settled on HIV as the virus they're blaming for AIDS. There's no reason to think any of those cause AIDS. In fact, that there's no virus at all that causes AIDS. AIDS is today 90% of AIDS cases in the United States and Europe, unlike in Africa. 90%, 9 out of every 10 AIDS cases, are still men. They're still men. This is unbelievable. This is not something you see in a venereal disease or a sexually transmitted disease or in the flu or any other disease that you can catch. All other transmitted diseases, sexually transmitted or flus or colds or anything else, are 50% men, 50% women within a very short period of time. Even the sexually transmitted diseases, including the venereal diseases and hepatitis B, which is bloodborne like HIV, they started out in the gay community, the homosexual community in the 1970s after the homosexuals came out of the closet after gay liberation and began to become sexually very active and promiscuous. They were the first to see these new diseases rise, but very quickly these diseases spread outward. They began to infect healthcare workers treating these homosexuals in hospitals. They began to go through prostitutes. They began to spread into the sexually active heterosexual population. That part of the population that's sexually active began to catch the disease. And within a couple of years, every one of those diseases became equal between men and women. And yet AIDS, after 15 years, is still 9 out of every 10 AIDS cases occurring in men. that is a dead giveaway that this is not caused by a virus, and it's not transmissible. It's something in the lifestyles of the people who are developing AIDS. If you look at those lifestyles, again, over 90%, maybe 94% of people who are developing AIDS in the United States or Europe are either homosexual men using large numbers of drugs for 10 years. I mean lots and lots of drugs. Or they are heroin addicts, who are the second most severe group of drug addicts, who are injecting drugs, cocaine or heroin, through needles right into their bloodstream. And again, that's the hardest core point of drug use. That's the end point after a person has tried all kinds of other drugs. That's the point at which they're ready to die. And that covers 94% of all AIDS cases in the United States and Europe. And then there are a few others of people who simply happen to have a tuberculosis or a pneumonia that gets renamed AIDS because the person also, by coincidence, happens to be HIV positive. And now in the last 7 to 8 years, we've been adding a number of AIDS cases through the AZT treatment. So we believe it's almost entirely drugs for almost everybody in the Western world. This is a classic case. Greg Louganis, who was recently referred to as having AIDS. Greg Louganis was, in fact, a very active homosexual and probably used quite a few drugs himself.
Well, we're going to go to our telephone line, and if you'd like to call in and ask Mr. Bryan Ellison some questions, feel free to do so. Brother Williams, do you have any questions at this time?
I just had one question in particular, and that is you kept referring to HIV and that it's not caused or related to AIDS per se. How does one get HIV? What is that? What causes it?
That's a very interesting question. HIV is a virus that can spread like viruses do, and if HIV caused AIDS, then you would see AIDS spreading out of the risk groups the way the virus can spread out of the risk groups. HIV, as I said earlier in the show, is about has infected about 13 or 14 million people worldwide. And the interesting thing, one of the things we have learned about retroviruses like HIV in animals and in humans over the last 80 years or 85 years that we've studied these viruses is that in general, in nature, these things are transmitted mother to child during pregnancy, so that when the child is born, it's already infected with the retrovirus. This is possible because the these viruses are so harmless, particularly these retroviruses, are so harmless that it never causes a disease. So you could be born with it, you'll never suffer disease, and you'll grow up to have your own children who will catch the virus, and it goes on and on like that. It is otherwise, unless you get it at birth, it's very difficult to transmit. So we believe that the great majority of people in the world, and probably just about everyone in Africa who has the virus, these people inherited it from their mothers, who in turn inherited it from their mothers. And we have good reason to believe that this virus is many centuries old in Africa and has never caused a problem there, and it's still not causing an AIDS epidemic there. We have some diseases associated with malnutrition and starvation over there that are being renamed AIDS, but they're different diseases than the homosexuals get in our country. And in fact, these are diseases that have been known with or without HIV in Africa for a long time. And many AIDS patients in Africa, if you simply feed them, some of them just do not get even adequate food. They're dislocated from civil war and strife and lack of food and access to food and other things. If you just feed them, many of them recover from what is called AIDS. But HIV there is probably transmitted mother to child during pregnancy. It probably happens quite a bit in this country too. There are about 1 million people in this country who are HIV positive. Most of those probably got it from their mothers during pregnancy. Now, if you are very sexually active, like a male homosexual in this country, then you finally begin to get a serious chance of picking up HIV too, because if you're having 1,000 partners a year or more, well, now the risk begins to go up, and so the homosexuals who are extremely promiscuous are the major group in this country that are beginning to spread HIV